Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shemuel Bet. Yes, you heard me correctly. We're starting a new sefer, kind of. It's not really a new sefer. I actually explained this a few times in different classes, but the breakdown of Perek Pasuk, of chapters and verses, and also of dividing up our Sfarim, like Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet, that was done by the Christians. And they did it to use the Tanakh against us because they wanted to make it easier to be able to quote scripture against us. So as you can tell, because you've been reading it, there is no real end. It's not as if Shmuel Aleph came to a natural break and Shmuel Bet is a whole new section. It's really a continuation. So Shemuel Bet, it's only just a way to break things down, but it's really a direct continuation from what we learned before. I'm going to bring up my sources, and we're going to discuss again. I brought a little bit of this in the beginning last week, when we talk about the messenger who came and the different accounts of how Shaul died. Here we're going to focus more on the messenger and what happens to him after his message. And I'm going to quote for you a midrash which is not on your sources, on who this potential person could be. We talked about this person being an Amalekite, because that's what it says, Amaleki. It also says ger, I am an Amalekite ger, stranger, not from here, or possibly converts. And then I came across a very, very interesting comment from Rashi, which I also, the one thought I wasn't going to include it. And then I saw it more in the Ma'am Loez, and I said, you know what? This is too good to resist. Do you remember our old friend, Doeg, who, I say friend, I'm using euphemistically, he wasn't very, he was the one who murdered all the people of Nov on Shaul's command. Says the Rashi here, V'nei ish ba min ha'machaneh, behold, a man came from the camp. Says Rashi, yesh bepesikta, there is a midrash, shezeh doeg, that this is none other than Doeg. Ve'eno miyoshev al libi. However, this does not fit well in my heart. I don't like this one. That this is Doeg, and he says that the reason why I don't like it is because Shaul is saying, "Who is this person?" Surely he should be able to recognize that it's Doeg. But interestingly enough, I actually thought this might actually be a very nice midrash. Again, what is the point of midrash? Midrash is not coming to teach me a historical fact. Midrash is coming to teach me a lesson. So if the lesson is, look Doeg, look Shaul, everything about you is connecting to you to what you did by not wiping out Amalek, then even this Amaleki youth isn't really an Amalekite. It really is Doeg. And Doeg was the one who convinced you not to wipe out the Amalekites. And it was Doeg who wiped out the city of Nov. So everything is reminding him. It's almost like Shaul's life is passing before his eyes as he's passing away. And also, when we remember when David kills Goliath, Shaul asks and says, who is this youth? He already knew who the youth was. So it doesn't surprise me that Shaul is not familiar, especially if Shaul right now is about to pass away, that he can be forgiven for not recognizing Doeg. Notwithstanding all of that, I still want to present to you Rashi, who says, Ve'eno meyoshev al libi. It still doesn't fit well with me. And the reason why I'm showing you that position is because often, who would I expect to have said that? I would have expected Rav David Kimchi, the Radak, to have said that. He would have said, why are you bringing a midrash? That's too far-fetched. But it's actually Rashi. Rashi is saying, that one is too far-fetched. But I wanted to have that there in your mind's eye, just as a background. I don't think it's pshuto shel mikra. It's not the simple way of understanding the text, but it is a nice lesson nonetheless. That there was clearly a deep found struggle within Shaul as he was dying. So let's begin. Pasuk Aleph. Vahi acharei mot Shaul. ודוד שב מהכות את העמלק, וישב דוד בצקלג ימים רבים. And it was after Shaul's death, and David had returned from beating the Amalekites, that David dwelt in Ziklag 2 days. I just want to look at this and have a look at a comment by the Malbim. And the Malbim says here, as the sun was setting on Shaul's rule, Scripture informs us of the sun rising of David's rule. Therefore, the Navi jumps to David's camp. But I think there's even more that can be learned from this pasuk. What's happening? Why is Shaul? Who kills Shaul? An Amalekite. The same nation that David is now striking. It's very interesting. The end of Shaul's reign is because because of that mercy that he showed to Amalek. As we're coming up to Purim and we're thinking about this, who is Mordechai? Mordechai is from the tribe of Binyamin. He is a descendant of Shaul. Who is Haman? Ben Agagi. He's a descendant of Agag, who Shaul let live. There's a constant battle here. So David is continuing this theme. David is saying, I'm wiping out Amalek. I'm trying to continue to do my mission. Whereas Shaul, he didn't complete his mission and had to wait till Mordechai, hundreds of years later, to conclude that mission. Anyway, we continue. Vayhi bayom hashlishi, and it was on the 3rd day. V'hinei ish ba min hamachaneh, and behold, a man came from the camp. Me'im Shaul, from Shaul. Uvgadav kiroim, his clothes were torn. V'adama al rosho, and there was dust on his head or ash. Vahi b'va'o el David, and it was when he came to David. Vayipol arza vayishtachu, he fell towards the ground and he bowed down. Vayomer lo David, and David said to him, Emizeh tavo, where are you coming from? Vayomer elav mimachane Yisrael nimnatati. He said to him, from the camp of Israel have I become a fugitive, have I escaped. Vayomer elav David, and David said to him, Mehaya hadavar, what's going on there? Haged nali, tell me. Vayomer asher nas ha'am milchama, the people fled from the battle. V'gam harbe nafal min ha'am, and a great many fell. Vayamutu, gam Shaul v'Yehonatan beno metu, and also Shaul and his son Yehonatan died. Remember last chapter, it wasn't just Shaul and Yehonatan, it was Shaul and his 3 sons. But clearly he's focusing on the important ones to David. Pasuk He, Vayomer David el Hana'al, Hamagid li, Ech yadata ki met Shaul v'Yehonatan beno. And David said to the youth who told him, how do you know that Shaul and his son Yehonatan died? What's the question here? Says the Abar Benel, did you see what happened? Were you there? Or did you just hear about it from others? Okay, is this a shmua? Is this a rumor you've heard? Or did you see it with your own eyes? I want to know about your testimony. Tell me exactly what you know and how you know it. Pasuk Vav, Vayomer Hana'ar Hamagid lo, and the youth who told him said, Nikro Nikreti, Baha Gilboa, והנה שאול נשען על חניתו, והנה הרכב ובעלי הפרשים הדביקוהו. And the youth told him, I chanced to be on Har Gilboa. Look at that lashon there. Nikro nikreti. Who's saying this? Again, forget about it being doeg for a second. Let's go with the pshat, that this was an Amalekite. I happen to be. There's no such thing as happenstance. There's no such thing as mikre. It happened. This was divine providence. Hashgacha pratit, that an Amalekite would be there. He was there, Har Gilboa, and behold, Shaul was leaning on his spear. What does it mean he was leaning on his spear? He'd fallen, most Paroshim understand this, that he'd fallen on his sword. He's leaning down, and the spear was the sword, or the sword was the spear. He's leaning on it because he'd fallen on it. And behold, and we learned this last week, the chariots and the leaders of the cavalry had overtaken him. And I said I didn't think that that was pshat because he was worried about the archers, not about the cavalry. But we go on. Vayifan acharav, vayireni, vayikra elai, vaomar hineni. And he turned around behind him and he saw me and he called to me. And I said, hineni, here I am. Again, the Amalekite trying to show his alacrity to this. Chet, vayomeli, and he said to me, Mi ata, who are you? Va'amar elav, and I said to him, Amaleki anochi, I am an Amalekite. Vayome elai, and he said to me, Amadna alai umateteni, stand over me now and put me to death. Ki achazani hashavatz ki chol od nafshi bi. For a shudder has seized me, for as long as my life is within me. What is this shuddering which is going on within Shaul? Says Rashi, the Midrash Haggadah explains, because of the iniquity of Nov, the city of Kohanim, which he had slain, concerning whom it is stated. What's going on? Shaul is in the moment of feeling that deep, deep knowledge of death. Mm-hmm. And when you're dying, what happens? There is remorse, there is regret. And what is the remorse and regret around Shaul? The things which he did wrong. He was seized with a feeling of depression, of fear of punishment because of what he'd done to the city of Nov. And again, that's where I think this midrash of the egg is coming from. Esther, what did you want to add?
Oh, I wrote it in the chat that the term happenstance and by chance is a hallmark of Amalek throughout.
Exactly right. Exactly, Esther. Very nice. So I think what's going on here, the Midrash is telling us this is the emotional state of Shaul. Shaul knows, and we talked about this last week, Shaul was not a bad king. Shaul had a problem very clearly with David, and that overcame him. But as a national leader, his two major sins were sparing Amalek and wiping out Nov. But other than that, he was pretty good. Not the greatest, but far from it, but far from being a bad king. And you can tell this from him, that a tzaddik is bothered by their averot. Their shortcomings is what keeps them up at night, is what literally is bothering him as he's about to die. Not he's going in with a clear conscience saying, okay, I did my best, it's time to die. He's still bothered by what he did. Pasuk Yud. Va'emod alav, so I stood over him, va'amotetehu, and I killed him. Ki yadati, for I knew, ki lo yichye acharei niflo, for I knew that he would not live after his fall. What does that mean? I knew that he would not live long after he'd already fallen on his sword, and so therefore, I wasn't really doing anything. In halacha, this is what's known as a terefa, someone who is going to die anyway within a short amount of time period. You're not really killing them if you kill them because they're going to die. So is it permitted? Is it really not they're still not allowed to do it, but it's not considered murder because that person is going to die anyway. We're going to get into this discussion soon. And here we see the pasuk says, "Va'ekach hanezer asher al rosho, ve'etzada asher al zera'o, va'aviem el Adoni hena." And I took the crown which was on his head, and the armlet which was on his arm, and I brought them to my Lord. Okay, that's the end of the description by the Amalekite. Says Rashi, what's the crown on his head and the bracelet on his arm? It's the tefillin shel yad and the tefillin shel rosh. And those are his tefillin. Literally, he went with his crown. What is the crown of glory of a Jewish person? That is wearing tefillin. He went into battle with his tefillin. Or, Pshuto shel mikra, he took the crown and the bracelet of the king and brought them to David to wear because he knew that David would be the next king.
I have a question, Rabbi Hassan.
Yes, Rob.
So there's a discrepancy between what actually happened and what this young man is saying, okay? And one of the reasons that it is speculated why there's a discrepancy is that the young man is embellishing the story to make himself look good, to claim to be the one who killed Saul, because he perceives that he's the enemy of David, and he's trying to curry favor with David, that he wants to get a positive reaction out of David.
Correct. This was one of the worst plans ever.
Right now, this leads to a larger question, though. I mean, how are we supposed to act as Jews when we hear of the death of an enemy? Okay, when we hear that someone who's maybe it's a political enemy, someone from the other political party dies, or maybe a world figure that we don't like, or maybe someone in our own family who we just never liked and couldn't stand. And we hear that they die. How are we supposed to react? Are we supposed to always react a certain way and say, "Oh, that's terrible news. I feel so bad"? Are we supposed to be honest about maybe feeling a little good that this person's dead? I mean, what are we supposed to do?
What are we supposed to do, or what we actually do are two different things. But what we're supposed to do, there's a verse in Mishlei that we should not rejoice at the downfall of our enemies. That's an important yesod, that we should not overly rejoice, because if we rejoice, then maybe Hakadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, may punish us for being not showing any compassion to their situation. Realistically, though, well, not realistically, but it may happen that sometimes we don't always react in the way that we should. But I think ideally, we should not feel that. I'm thinking about that. Rubisa, I don't understand your comment.
Well, I missed a small section, but in response to Rob, I was thinking about how we don't overly rejoice at the death of others, and we see that vis-a-vis when we recount the makot at the Seder and we reduce our wine to reduce our joy.
I was thinking about Purim because I'm starting with Purim. You're already on to Pesach. There you go. Yain and makot. There you go. Sorry. There. Sorry, I'm clearly a month out of the calendar. There you go. Very good. Nicely done, Rabisa. Absolutely. We don't. Again, ideally, we want to be in a situation where we take the high road. Are we always able to take the high road? Not necessarily, but our tradition tells us to take the high road. Okay. Now we're going to see David's response, and we're going to try and break it down and try and understand what's happening. Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayachazek David bivgadav, vayikra'em. David took hold of his clothes and he tore them. And you notice there, it's not, he didn't tear one item of clothing, it's in the plural there. So he's tearing clothes. V'gam kol ha'anashim asher ito. And not only did he tear his clothes, but all the people with him also tore their clothes. Vayispedu, vayivku, vayatsumu, and they eulogized, and they bewailed, and they fasted until the evening. Al Shaul, for Shaul, Val Yehonatan, because of Yehonatan, Beno, Va'al Am Hashem, and for the people of Israel, Va'al Beit Yisrael, and for the whole house of Israel, Kinah Becharev, for they had fallen by the sword. Okay, so there's a very severe and sincere sense of grief taking on David's camp, something which we might be surprised about since David has been on the run for so long. Tearing clothes. The Gemara Moed Katan says, from where do we know that one must rent one's clothes on the death of the Nasi, or the president of the court, and upon hearing evil tidings? It's from this pasuk. When David heard about the defeat of Israel and the death of Shaul and his sons, then David took hold of his clothes and rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him. David tore 3 sets of garments, one for Shaul's death, one for Yehonatan's death, and one for the tragedy of the national loss of life. Okay? So here we learn that if the president dies, you do Kriyah. If the Av Beit Din dies, we do Kriyah. If a large amount of Jews die in battle, it's Ra'ui, it's fitting to tear Kriyah. Vayomer David, go back to Yud Gimel here. Vayomer David el Hanal Hamagidlo, Emi Ze'ata. And David said to the youth who told him, from where are you? Vayomer ben Ish Ger Amaleki Anochi. And he said, I am the son of an Amalekite convert. Or at least I am the son of an Amalekite stranger. And David asks him a question, a fundamental question. Vayomer elav David, Ech lo yareta lishloach yadcha leshachet et Mashiach Adonai? But did you not fear to stretch forth your hand to destroy God's anointed? How could you kill the king, even if he was going to die anyway? Vayikra David le'achad me'ane'arim, vayomer gash pegabo, vayakehu vayamot. And David called one of the youths and said, go near and strike him. And he struck him, and he died. Vayomer elav David, and David said to him, Damcha al roshecha, your blood shall be on your head. Ki picha, for your mouth, Anabecha, has testified against you. Lemor, saying, Anochi motati et Mashiach Adonai, I have slain the God's anointed. You deserve to die. You killed him. You said it with your own words. And we have a number of questions here. Mainly, how was the Amalekite's death justified? I'm going to jump into this, but before that, he says, Ger Amaleki Anochi, or Ben Ger Amaleki Anochi. Abarbanel says, the lad realized that he had not ingratiated himself with David. He knew, he realized this was bad news he was bringing. This was not the Besorot Tovot that he was hoping for. This was not the reward he was going to get from David. So he lied to try to save himself by saying he was a convert. But as you see it through it, David said, you can't be a convert. If you were a convert, you would have feared to kill Shaul. So how was the Amalekite's death justified? There are many challenges with David's actions. Number one, the Amaleki was following Shaul's command. Number two, one is not punishable in Torah law when one incriminates oneself. Okay? If I say bad things about myself, I cannot die. There needs to be edim. Number three, not David was mortally wounded. That's a mistake there. Shaul was mortally wounded. killing someone who is mortally wounded is not considered murder. Again, it's not something you're allowed to do. Okay, we cannot end one's life prematurely. However, it's not considered murder either. It's still a severe transgression, but it's not murder. Number 4, there was no trial and there were no edim. So there's a number of things here we should say to ourselves. The Amaleki did the wrong thing, but he's not chayav mitah, he's not deserving of death. So how is it that David had him killed? Says the Ralbag on the point that the Amaleki was just following orders. When one hears the words of the master and the words of the student, who should you listen to? So how could you kill Shaul if the Torah forbids you from killing him? Don't use that as an excuse. I was just listening to what Shaul said. If your parent told you to break Shabbat, you're not allowed to break Shabbat. Why? Because the words of the master are more important than the words of the student. There's certain things which we know that when they contravene Torah, we cannot say, well, I was just listening to what somebody else told me to do, even if it's the king. The Rambam in Hilchot Sanhedrin actually addresses our issue. And he says it's a scriptural decree that the Bet Din has no power to execute a person or even give him malkut because of his own admission. Instead, the punishments are given on the basis of the edut of 2 edim, of 2 witnesses. Yehoshua's execution of Achan and David's execution of the Amalekite convert were because of their own statements. Why were they allowed to be killed? Well, with Achan, how was he found guilty? He was found guilty because of the Urim v'Tumim, and then he confessed. But there you could say it's clear that that was Hashem's will. Here, there is no God's will here. The Urim v'Tumim were not brought up. He just confessed on his own. He shouldn't deserve to die. Says the Rambam, either I can say this was a hora'at sha'ah, a ruling for that time only, that David just acted, we're not learning from this how to behave in future times. It was just, he made a decision. Or it's what's known as a hora'at malkut. He made a royal decision, which is a regular person cannot do this, but because he's the king, he has the power to kill someone even without proper trial and beit din and having proper edim. Rashi says, your blood shall be on your head. There is no penalty for your death except to yourself. Okay, so Rashi is kind of lining up here the similar positions, which is, you know what, we've gone through it. If David is acting as king, he's making a decision on the spot not to be learned from. But this boy, he made a miscalculation. Yes, David and Shaul were enemies, but David had the ultimate respect for the position of authority of the king. And therefore, anyone who murders a king or puts the end of the life of the king, well, guess what? I'm going to be king next. So what am I going to do other than I must kill anyone who does regicide? Anyone who does regicide, the punishment is death. Okay? And we see this throughout Shemuel. When we'll see this when Ishbosheth, and I'm not going to do some spoilers here, when the final son of Shaul is killed, what does David do? He has those who killed them, those who did regicide, they too are killed. There's no reward for anyone who takes the life of a king of Israel. Now, what we're going to focus on now is the Kinah, the lamentation which David sang with the people over the death of Shaul and Yehonatan. It's the last 10 or so psukim of this chapter. And let's read them all together, and then we'll look at the commentaries. Vaikonen David et hakina hazot al Shaul v'al Yehonatan beno. And David lamented with this lamentation over Shaul and over Yehonatan his son. Vayomer lelamed b'nei Yehuda kashet, hine ketuva al sefer hayashar. And he said to teach the sons of Yehuda kashet. Now kashet normally means bow, but we're going to have a look at, there's a different understanding of what this word kashet means. And maybe it comes from the word kasher. The children of Yehuda need to learn difficulty. Behold, it is written in the book of the just. You know what? I'm going to break. We are going to look at that one pasuk, and then we'll read the rest of it. Rashi says, "Teach the sons of Yehuda kashet," and he said to teach the sons of Yehuda the bow. And David said, since the heroes of Israel have fallen, the Bnei Yehuda must teach them to wage war and to draw the bow, which is basically what's it saying? From now, or until now, Binyamin has been the tribal leader. Binyamin has been the king. Shaul is the king from Binyamin. But now, kings are going to come from Yehuda. It's now Yehuda's role to be in charge. It's a nice position, but it doesn't make sense if this is a language of Kinah, of lamentation. So Abarbanel has a different answer. He says, yes, normally keshet means bow. But here, it's coming from the word kasher, meaning difficulty or hardship. We must teach Bnei Yehuda, who are Shaul's opponents, to feel the proper sadness upon his death. They should feel the overwhelming loss of such a great man who wore the crown of Israel. In response to Rob's comment at the beginning, how are we meant to respond when an enemy, a political enemy, dies? Should we pretend to be sad? No, don't pretend to be sad. Teach them how to be sad. Because even if Shaul was an imperfect leader, he was still king of Israel. And therefore, we who are going to take on the mantle of leadership, which is going to be the case, Yehuda is going to take on that leadership. Kings will come from Yehuda. They will come from the line of David. They must learn how to grieve for Shaul before we can continue. And I think, not that Rashi isn't pshat, but I think the Abarbanel there has a really good, close understanding to the pshat of the pasuk there. Hatzevi Yisrael al bamotecha halal, O beauty of Israel, on your high places shall lie the slain. Ech naflu giborim, how have the heroes fallen? How the mighty have fallen. Al tagidu begat, al tevasseru bechutzot Ashkelon, pen tismachna benot Perishtim, pen ta'alozna benot ha'arelim. Tell it not in Gat, announce it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Perishtim rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Harei v'Gilboa, al tal ve'al mata lechem, ושתי תרומות כי שם נגאל מגן גיבורים, מגן שאול בלי משיח בשמן. O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor shall you be fields of heave offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was rejected. Shaul's shield was as though not anointed with oil. Midam chalalim mechelet giborim keshet, Yehonatan, lo nasor acho v'cherev Shaul lo tashuv rekam. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, Yehonatan's bow did not turn back, nor did Shaul's sword return empty. Shaul v'Yehonatan, hanehavim v'neimim b'chayehem uv'motam lo nifradu, min nesharim kalu, me'arayot gaveru. Shaul and Yehonatan, his son, who were beloved and pleasant in their lifetime, and in their death they were not separated. They were swifter than eagles and mightier than lions. But not Yisrael el Shaul bechena, hamalbishchem shani im adanim hama'aleh adi zahav al levushchem. O daughters of Israel, weep over Shaul, who dressed you in crimson with delights, who put golden ornaments on your clothes. Ech naflu giborim betoch hamilchama Yehonatana bamotecha halal. How did the mighty fall in the midst of the battle? Yehonatan, on your high places you were slain. Tsar li alecha, achi Yehonatan na'amta li me'od niflata, avatcha li me'ahavat nashim. I am distressed for you, my brother Yehonatan. You were very pleasant to me. Your love was more wonderful to me than the love of women. Ech naflu giborim vayovedu klei milchama. How have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? It's a Kinah which will bring us to tears as we read of the sadness of the death of Shaul and Yehonatan. Says the Abarbanel, Ech naflu giborim, how the mighty have fallen. This is the refrain of the Kinah that the community would repeat after David. He would say the pasuk, and then they would say, Ech naflu giborim. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions, says Rashi, to perform the will of their creator. That's what they did. Ratz kanesher. This is how we're meant to be. That's how we serve Hashem, with alacrity, with zrizut. And this comment, your love was greater than that of women, says the Radak, my love for Yehonatan was greater than my love for my two wives. And the Ralbag adds, unlike my love for my wives, which has a physical desire connected to it, my love for Yehonatan was pure. There was nothing in there. There was no physical desire. There was no ta'ava connected to it. My love was pure, a pure respect of two souls bonded together, of pure mutual respect and understanding. This is not the way that people understand it, that there was a physical love affair between David and Yehonatan. That's what the Perushim are explaining here. It's not like love of women, which has a carnal desire to it. This is a pure love, which has nothing to do with carnal desire. It only has to do with mutual admiration. But look at this. For all of that, who does David first lament? It's Shaul, Melech Yisrael. And this is what we have to understand. David had respect for the office, for the authority of the king of Israel. And it was ra'ui, it was appropriate and fitting that proper hesped should be done for Shaul. Esther. No? Okay. This is the end of, to me, that should be the end of Shemuel Bet, Shemuel Aleph. And next parak should be the beginning of Shemuel Bet, if I was to divide it up. But again, enough of me blasting the Christians. But you know what? They deserve a little blasting. They gave us a hard time during, more than just a hard time, during that period of time. But I really think there's many lessons that we can learn from this. But one is that how much kavod one has to show for the kingship. Number two, how much Shaul was tortured at the end of his life, how much it bothered him, the mistakes that he had made. And number three, how to properly eulogize people when they die. And I think this is something that we're losing the act of. Again, not always do great people die, but too often we don't eulogize well enough. There's an important thing here of the goal of a eulogy. The goal of a eulogy should invoke emotion. It should create tears, and it should evoke desire to better oneself, to allow the midot of the person who passed to live on. Shaul was not a bad king. Shaul made two mistakes, and he had a vendetta against David. But I repeat, Shaul was a good king, and he was measured as such. He wasn't ra'ui for the kingship to be for him forever and ever. No, that's David. But if we're only comparing him to David, okay, he's not as great a king. but he wasn't in that league of bad kings, which we'll see when we get into Melachim.
You know,
All right.
textual support for that also as well, because in verse 24 of the lament, you know, David directly speaks to the daughters of Israel. It's those are the only people who he addresses in the lament that are still alive. You know, Saul and Jonathan can't respond. The Philistines are not supposed to be spoken to, and he addresses the hills which are not alive. So the women are the only ones who he addresses that are alive. And what does he say when he talks to them? He speaks about them you know, being clothed in fine linens and finery and gold and robes and jewels, and this was never mentioned in the first book of Samuel. This is the wealth and prosperity was never mentioned. But I think what David is saying here, and what you're saying, Rabbi Hassan, is really lining up very well. Is that, you know, Saul was a good king, you know, and when you look back, think of all the good things that he did, and I think that's why specifically the riches and the prosperity and the golden robes are mentioned to the women here, so that we could be reminded of that.
Yeah, and Rob, just to add a point, why is he mentioning it to the women? It was the women who were teasing and saying that Shaul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. If it wasn't for the girls and the women, there wouldn't have been the enmity between David and Shaul, and therefore Shaul would not have been jealous of David, and therefore, even more so to say, Shaul was a good king who made two very fateful mistakes. But, and also, where are the men? You're right, all the young men died on the battle, so there's only old men left. And these women, and maybe that's what they're meant to think about, perhaps your jokes in your songs, and understand, instead of singing stories of battle, you should be singing songs of lament. That's how we do it. Tochacha, musar, rebuke. That is the way to move forward, to strengthen oneself. More than we learn from our victories, we learn from our mistakes. And perhaps that was some musar there that David was giving to the women. Okay, that's the end of Shemuel Bet Perek Aleph.